thank you guys for coming. And it'll be a smaller, more intimate session. So we'll try to keep it lively as far as possible. Typically a lot of these, we read the bio of the person to introduce them, but you guys can read the bio right there. I'm hoping more that let's get into the conversation and the bio will come out as part of the conversation.
It's quite a challenge, though, to have a lively conversation about solitary confinement. Although I think, with this moderator, we can do it.
We'll try our best. But I should say I have a little bit of history with Sarah going back many years. This is when I was still in San Francisco and working as an editor. And at that time, I was working for a nonprofit news service in San Francisco called New America Media. And a young man came into our office one day and he said he was going to the Middle East to work. And he was going there to travel, and he wanted to freelance for a while, and whether we would be interested in his stories. He was going to various outlets, trying to, as all freelancers do, cobble together some kind of, a network of people willing to accept those stories. So we said, sure. So this guy's name was Shane Bauer, and he went to the Middle East and he started filing stories. And then one day, I suddenly woke up and saw an email from someone saying, hey, is this Shane Bauer the same Shane Bauer who writes for you guys? And I was like, what? And it said, it says he's been just captured. He and two others have been captured by the Iranian government and put into prison. And we were like, oh, shit. Because we didn't really know what to do or and then it turned, when we read the story more, it turned out it was Shane and Sarah and their friend Josh who were in prison. And it was kind of a black box. I mean, we were a small, dinky nonprofit as well. And, it's not like we had particularly resources to figure out what was happening. Long short of it, that story started then, and for Sarah, it didn't end till 410 days later when she was actually released. And I was reading that the UN Special Rapporteur against torture says that 15 days can cause permanent brain damage. This was 410 days in solitary confinement. And while I was reading up a little bit for this interaction, I came across an old bio of you, those little author bios, and it described you as teacher activist from California, loves fresh broccoli, zapatistas, and anyone who can change her mind. And that seems like a long time ago.
I forgot about that completely. Yeah, that's great. I think that was, I had just opened Facebook before I was in prison, and that was just days before that I did that description.
Wow. Yeah. So I wanted you to start by telling the audience who may not be completely aware of the story, how you guys, you go to the Middle East, to Kurdistan. How did you end up in Iranian prison?
Well, it was an extension. I mean, I think that after 9/11, 9/11 kind of cemented my identity as a global citizen. As you saw in my very early Facebook bio, for years I'd been working with the Zapatistas. Have people heard about the Zapatistas at all? It's a movement in southern Mexico that's still going on, 25 years strong. It's an autonomous indigenous movement where they rose up in 1991, reclaimed a lot of the land that had been taken away from indigenous people, and started to create their own society within a society, their own hospitals, their own schools, their own clinics, autonomous from the Mexican government, which had never treated them like equal citizens. So I lived in Mexico. I went back and forth helping create this autonomous infrastructure with the Zapatistas. Then 9/11 happened, and I became very active in the anti-war movement, a lot of direct action against the war. And the anti-war movement kind of fizzled out. And then Shane and I decided to move to Syria. And I was teaching Iraqi refugees in Syria. One of the things that Assad did that was actually a positive legacy is let in over 1 million Iraqi refugees after the US-led wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So a lot of Iraqis that had been in college in Iraq and their colleges were destroyed were in Syria and wanted to pursue higher education, and we were helping them do that. And I was starting out as a journalist. Actually, I think New American Media was the first online platform I ever published anything as a journalist. And I had a week off of my job, and so we went to northern Iraq, which at the time, northern Iraq was a very safe place. No American had ever, it wasn't part of the war, it wasn't a war zone. No American had ever been kidnapped or killed there in recent decades. Of course, now it's under control of ISIS, some areas, and it's very contentious, and I wouldn't recommend going there. But at the time, the New York Times had northern Iraq, Iraqi Kurdistan, as one of the top 10 adventure travel destinations that they recommended. And even the State Department said it wasn't dangerous. So we were very unlucky. If we made any mistake, we hiked too far. We were behind this beautiful tourist site with hundreds of people that were camping overnight and dancing and singing. For some reason, when the Iraqi Kurds go camping, they bring their televisions. So there were like dozens of televisions. I still don't know how they powered them. But anyway, to say the least, our guards were down. We were among really friendly people. We were in a safe part of the Middle East that's actually very pro-American, which was strange also for me to experience walking around Iraqi Kurdistan. And when people found out that we were American, they'd say, George Bush, you know? Yeah. And
I'm not in Turkey anymore.
I know, exactly. But yeah, we went for a hike. It's an unmarked border. And somewhere near the border, we were ordered at gunpoint across the border into Iran by soldiers, and then we were from there. It descended into the most horrifying experience of my life, of being kidnapped, blindfolded, passed around from group to group. Eventually, we ended up in Tehran, and we were taken to the most notorious political prison in Iran, Evin prison, where many dissidents and pro-democracy activists have been executed. And that's where I was held in isolation for over a year.
I assume at first, since you guys were just hiking, you thought, this is a silly mistake. They'll figure this out. We'll be released anytime soon. When did reality sink in?
There's this kind of cognitive dissonance. It seems like it must be a nightmare. Literally, it seems like the next day you're going to wake up. It's something that I felt was impossible. Nothing that I ever imagined could happen to me. And so there's this. Have you read Kafka at all? In Metamorphosis, when he wakes up as a cockroach. And he just can't believe that he's a cockroach. And he's absolutely convinced that it must be a dream. It's a similar experience. You can't believe it's true. And you try to convince yourself that it's true. And I think it was probably about 6 months when it really hit me, when my interrogator told me, every day I thought will be the last day. And my interrogator told me, this is a political situation. If your government doesn't do anything for you, you may never get out. And it definitely hit me hard.
You have an anthology out now called Hell is a Very Small Place, about solitary confinement. And you begin the preface by saying, at some point you're going to snap. This might be after 1 week or 1 year. When you were confined, do you remember, is there a point that you can identify in that way as a snapping point?
Yeah, that day that my interrogator told me I may never get out, I went back to my cell and I was sort of just crouched in the corner, rocking back and forth. It was like I could see myself from very high up, an experience of being completely detached and from my body. And I heard a screaming, and I thought for sure that another woman in another cell was screaming, and all I could think of was please stop screaming, whoever you are. And the guards burst into my cell, and I was screaming. And that was a moment where I saw myself, from this detached kind of aerial view as someone insane, someone that had completely lost her mind. And I thought, that can't be my story. I can't let that happen. There's a way that other people have survived this. People in American prisons have survived it, people all around the world. I have to find my inner resources that will show me the path out of this, because I have to walk out of here, a stronger person and a better person, and I can't walk out of here broken.
And I remember initially, for the first few months, you were not allowed to call your mother or anything, so you didn't really have any contact with the outer world. So how did you remind yourself that you existed, that you had not been forgotten?
It's a very deep question. It's a hard question to answer. I've struggled. How did I remind myself? I would reruns. I called them, I would rerun every experience of my life, whether positive or negative. Even the worst experiences felt like the most beautiful experience, just to be allowed to be part of the mess, part of the pain and the beauty and the chaos of life. I imagined, the world, the name of our memoir, A Sliver of Light. It comes from every morning some light would come into the cell. The windows were high up and they were barred and covered in perforated metal. So not much light would come in, but the sliver would move across my cell in an arc during the day. And that's how I would keep track of time. And one morning I was lying awake waiting for the light to come in, and it came in and just illuminated all of the little dust motes in the cell. And I saw every one of them as a person with a story and a history and a future, someone I maybe had loved, maybe I had hated, and they were all still part of the stream of life, and I was taken out of it. And I had a moment of peace where I thought, as long as it goes on without me, it's okay. I need to let go of it. I may not get back to it. And those moments of peace, I think, really, really helped.
And at this time, how much contact are you able to have with Shane and Josh?
I would hear them down the hall. Sometimes whenever they would pass, we figured out which halls we were in. So we would shout each other's names or shout, "I love you," little messages. But for a while, and also we would be interrogated in cells next to each other so we could hear each other from afar, and that was about it.
But there was something I remember reading about, something called once you were able to sneak out of your cell to meet Shane, and there was something called dressing up Fridays. What was that about?
Yeah, eventually they let us, especially after they started to worry about my mental health. Shane and Josh were put together, but they said I couldn't be with an Iranian woman because Iranian women would hate me, which was, of course, the opposite. The other women were so kind to me. They would sing songs to me down the hallway. They would put little notes in my cell and candies. But eventually they would let me see Shane and Josh for short periods. And yeah, we came up with whatever little rituals we could to pass the time and give each other joy. And
so tell us a little bit about how eventually you got out, and what was that like for you coming back? Because you got out, they were still in there.
Yeah. Well, my release was just as sudden, really, as my captivity. Just one day, the guards came to my cell and gave me, a manto, the Iranian, long dress, and, a hairbrush. For the first time, I got to brush my hair. And so they told me, you're going home. And when we got to the end of the hall and Shane and Josh weren't there, I tried to refuse. I tried to say I won't go. And I even, sat on the ground because I didn't want to leave without them. And they had to bring in my lawyer, and my lawyer explained to me that I could help on the outside, that there was no point in staying in prison when I could actually have more power. So, getting out, leaving them was horrible. But it gave me a real sense of purpose, a sense that I had my voice back. And as soon as I got off the plane, of course, there's this sea of media, and I was on Oprah, and I met with President Obama, President Ahmadinejad, and I started to get a real sense of, the fact that they let me out because they wanted this whole thing to be over, and that in a way, my presence on the outside was sort of a testimony to our overall innocence. The Iranian government was still trying to keep up this facade that we were spies and that we were some kind of danger, but they hadn't shown any evidence, and they refused to even try us. We were just being held, incommunicado as detainees. So that first year when Shane and Josh were still inside, I definitely sort of used the strength that I found inside to just continuously use pressure. Everyone tells you to be quiet in situations like that. The State Department says don't rock the boat, don't do any media, don't criticize the Iranian government. And for the first 6 months, I was forced to listen to them, and our families, everyone said, we just need to wait this out. And then eventually I got so frustrated that I started to talk about the abuse, that Shane and Josh had been physically beaten, that I was held in, conditions that the UN considers to be psychological torture. And as soon as I started to be critical, the Iranian government responded. They called me a liar. They said that I couldn't be trusted. But even that negative response showed that I had gotten their attention, that they were on the defense. And things started to move. Shane and Josh got a visit. Then a few months later, they were released.
So what was it like for you, since this is a media conference as well, for you to be, you were there as a journalist, your writings, pieces and stuff. Now you're suddenly the story. You're on the other side, your journalists are interviewing you. What was that experience like for you?
It's awful. You absolutely, you absolutely need the media in that situation, because if we didn't have, and at the same time, you're grateful for it, right? If we didn't have years of attention on our case, the U.S. government would have no incentive to do anything for us. And also the Iranian government would have no incentive, no pressure to release us. So the media is crucial. But the media in that situation, the Iranian government has all of the control, because no one could ask our side of the story when we were arrested. So the story, by the time I was released, people already believed they knew the story, even though that story was a fiction. No one knew what had happened on that border until I came out and I could say it. But once there's a story out there, it's almost impossible to change it. So to try to shift that narrative was sort of my mission. And also, you're sort of portrayed as a caricature, as these idealistic, young Berkeley. So many lies, so much misinformation. I never lived in Berkeley. I live in Oakland. If you're from the Bay, you realize that's actually very different, culturally speaking. And to be, kind of stereotyped and put into this caricature is, it can be very demoralizing. But you also have to court it, and because you need it, because your survival and your freedom depends on it.
So tell us a little bit about, what have you learned from that experience about both the power and the limitations of media?
Well, I'm much more skeptical of what I read. Having, seen so many lies printed about yourself, I'm much more skeptical of what I read, and of course I'm much more vigilant about how I portray others. It's really essential to humanize people, but really it's really essential to actually listen to them and, not project onto them your own stereotype, or not try to fit them into something that society already feels is a category that needs to be filled, if that makes sense. Whether it's a prisoner or a Muslim, or we have these preconceptions, and it's so important that we challenge them with nuance in our work.
When you say it's important to humanize them, do you think you would be able to humanize, for example, your captors, the guards?
Would I be able to humanize them? You mean like if I were to write about them?
Yeah, if you were about... you have written the memoir, but, was it a struggle in the course of it, to think of them as anything but the guards who are holding you in captivity right there?
Yes, it was a struggle. There's a part of my book where I talk about when I was first captured, and this guard, Narges, it was her job to do the strip search. And I was terrified. I was crying, and I was just asking to call my mother. And, she just kept saying, undress, undress like a stone, it's a stone face. And I looked at her, and at first she just looked like a hideous, horrible image of humanity to me. And then, I looked into her eyes, and she had the most beautiful eyes. And they just stood out to me like, they reminded me of the ocean, like a sort of gray, cloudy day, with this sparkle in them, like the light on the waves. And I told her, your eyes are so beautiful. And her face broke into this smile. And all of a sudden, she kind of giggled. And there was this moment of just beauty between us. And then she got so angry with me for breaking that facade that I think from then on out, she was harder on me. And she always, she would push me down the hall, and she wouldn't talk to me. And so in a way that I needed to humanize them, because I needed to not be consumed by my anger and rage. I needed to be able to interact with them in a civil way. They were my only human contact. But they resisted being humanized because I think it's so much harder to do that job if you're in any way relating to the person that you have to, treat like. You have to enforce these conditions of torture on someone. And if you see them as a human being, it's much harder to do that.
Yeah, I mean, you have to see them, and we were talking before this, as the other and very firmly as almost an object. Mm-hmm. So for many people, if a movie was being made about your story, it would probably end with that moment of release. That's when the end credits would roll. That is the sort of the climax. But as you've shown, the story obviously doesn't end there, because in a way another chapter opens up, which is heavily influenced by what has happened to you. And one of the things that struck with me was something that you said afterwards was the prison, you left the prison, but the prison is in you. Mm-hmm. What did you mean by that?
I think, in the early days, I was very emotional. I cried a lot. I begged for help. After months, I developed this, very tough exterior, very, very thick skin. I think the last 8 or 9 months of prison, I never cried. And you create these walls inside walls, these inner defenses. And so you can be released into the world and those obvious walls come down, but it's much harder to bring down the inner walls, the protective layers that you develop. And so the first year, I don't think I really felt at all free. I didn't feel really any emotion. I felt sort of like robotic. And, a lot of people thought, oh, you seem fine, you look great. And the actual scars and the pain, you carry it so deeply that people can't see it. That's part of the insidiousness of psychological torture, is that you can't even understand what's been done to you, let alone explain it to other people.
And you said, correct me if I'm wrong, or whether it was you or somebody else who said it, that you found it hard, in fact, after coming out, to look into another person's eyes without a sense of discomfort.
Yeah, it was physically painful to look at people, and people would, touch me and I would jump. And I thought it would be the opposite. I thought as soon as I got out, I would just be in pure joy and just hugging everyone. But I wanted to go back. I wanted to crawl back into my own safe place. Lucky for me, I didn't have that option. I needed to be constantly at the forefront of this movement, to free my companions. And in a way that forced me out of this urge to retreat and to go inside myself.
So given all of that, why did you feel that instead of trying to put this firmly behind me as far as possible, I am going to go and reach out to other people confined in solitary confinement in the US, which, most of us don't necessarily think, we think of Iran or North Korea or places as where people are thrown into these solitary confinement prison, but the US has an enormous population. Why did you feel the need to go out and talk to these people again, in a way, reliving perhaps some of what happened to you?
Well, when I found out that over 100,000 people in the U.S. on any given day are held in conditions almost identical to how I was confined in Iran, I was deeply shocked. I knew that our system of mass incarceration was broken and inhumane and overbloated, but I had no idea of the scale of this use of torture. And so I wrote about it in the New York Times, and there was a lot of response, a lot of people asking me to speak about it. And I realized I didn't know how to speak about it because I didn't even really understand what had happened to me. And so I think originally reaching out to other prisoners and survivors of solitary confinement was an attempt to understand what I had gone through. And it was purely a human impulse. And then I was just completely blown away by the humanity of people that I met. And again, shocked by the fact that they were often put in solitary confinement for completely arbitrary reasons. It's used as a sort of control mechanism inside that I think enables the system of mass incarceration. Because we have more than 2 million people in prison in the US, we don't have the kind of infrastructure or resources. We're not willing to spend the kind of resources to to imprison them in a humane way. And so if someone organizes, if someone is politicized inside prison, if they speak up or act out with the guards, you can just throw them in the hole, you can disappear them. And that threat of torture, I think, maintains somewhat of a status quo that enables mass incarceration.
So what's interesting to me also is that, as you said, yes, you're at some level, you were aware of the fact that the prison system is broken, that so many people, you may not know the exact number, but huge number of people are in prison for all kinds of petty reasons. As we all are in India aware of various kinds of social inequities, whether it's bonded labor, caste violence, whatever it is. We know these things exist. But for you, because having directly sort of experienced that, not in the US context, but in an Iranian context, you have a certain empathetic connection to it suddenly now, not something you sought out, that was thrust upon you. How, talk a little bit about, as a journalist then, in telling the story, the struggle between telling the facts and the empathy for the audience, how you kind of figured that out, because sometimes as journalists we often assume that we must just lay out the facts and the facts will tell the story.
Right. Well, that's what I started doing. I was writing for the Daily Beast. I was just doing journalism, not just on solitary confinement, but on a whole host of issues around mass incarceration. And I was frustrated by the fact that everyone that was reading the articles that I was writing, I felt like already agreed with me. Maybe it was strengthening their argument. Maybe it was giving them, material to use in their classes, and all of that's really valuable. But, how do you get outside of these, enclaves of like-minded people? And that problem is so much more obvious now with social media, that the people that follow you on Twitter, the people that follow you on Facebook, even if maybe the facts will strengthen their argument, they're making that argument with people that are already open and ripe to being persuaded that solitary confinement is torture, for example. So I think that, I've studied cognitive science quite a bit. I'm fascinated by how the brain works. A lot of that stems from the fact that I was psychologically tortured and I wanted to know what happened to my brain, and how it affects people. But, cognitive science shows us that most people are far more persuaded by story and narrative than they are by facts. And really in my work, what I've tried to do is bring those two things together so that you can actually appeal to both people's reason and their empathy. And I think it actually makes a much stronger argument.
So was that a reason why, after you went around the US talking to people in solitary confinement, collecting their stories, you could have done a very definitive nonfiction book about it, but you chose to do something very different, which nobody would have thought you could do out of this, which is do a play out of it. Was that the reason?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I wanted people to, viscerally experience the horror, of course, of what exists in their own backyards, in prisons that they may drive by in their car on the way, to visit a relative, and never step inside, never meet someone who's been inside or come out of it. I wanted them to experience the horror viscerally, but also the humanity, right? Because a lot of people, everyone who knows someone who's been to prison understands, right? But a lot of people haven't known someone who's been to prison. A lot of people especially in my country, white people, right? If you're a person of color, most likely you've met someone that's been in prison. If you're a white person, not necessarily. So people would meet me and I would be the first person that they'd ever met that had been in prison. So with theater, again, it goes back to how our brains work, cognitively, that when you're experiencing a really strong narrative, the part of your brain that responds is the same part of your brain that responds to actual lived experience. So you're literally walking in people's shoes when you're immersed in their story, the details and the nuances of their emotional lives, their internal lives. That's why novels and fiction are so powerful. So if you can combine journalism with this, powerful narrative tool, then you get the empathy that actually changes the way that people act in the world. It changes who they vote for. It changes where they want to spend their money. It changes, actual tangible material conditions.
So what year was Opening the Box, the play? When did it premiere?
Last year.
It was last year. So in that course of this year, have you felt that impact?
Yeah. I mean, people come up to me and they tell me that, they still think about a certain character, and to them it feels like a real person. A lot of people bring up this character that is a white supremacist. And so for the first act of the play, you see him in his cell. There's 6 people, 3 at the bottom. They're in boxes, basically, 3 at the bottom, 3 at the top. The first whole act, he doesn't even speak, and you just see a swastika on his chest. And of course, you hate him. You think he's this pure evil. And in the second act, he comes out and he starts to speak, and you find out a lot of things about him. You find out that he struggles with his sexuality, that he has a lot of shame around a lot of the things that he did when he was a younger man as a white supremacist in prison. You also find out that for the 27 years he's been in solitary confinement, every day he's learned a new word. So he has this incredible vocabulary, and he's based on a real person that I met and visited many times in prison. And so this kind of story, all of a sudden, he can't be a number to anyone. It's someone that most of us are deeply wired to hate and think he deserves whatever he gets. This white supremacist guy with a swastika on his chest. But then you find out these things about him, and you think, well, if I was put in that situation, would I have such depth that I would learn a new word every day? Would I have that kind of, tenacity and perseverance and love of life?
And that's fascinating, because I think that's something as journalists we also grapple with, because, for example, when you were saying that many people are obviously in prison for very justified reason. They've done something horrible. And I remember there was this debate here, I don't know if you guys remember, when the Nirbhaya case happened, when the rapists went to prison, people who were writing stories about the young men who committed the gang rape had to tussle with this idea when people would say, why are you humanizing them? These are people who are being sent to capital punishment. Or, on the other hand, with someone involved in a terror attack is in prison, then suddenly the story comes out about what he eats in jail or something like that. And this is a struggle that people face all the time, where it's easier to put people in a box, as opposed to deal with the complicated, messy realities of lives and be able to see each other in them.
Yeah, but if we're putting someone in a box, most likely someone else is putting us in a box, right? None of us are absolved from that kind of us and them, that sort of cognitive tribal mentality. So if you go around and you can go through life that way, but how does it benefit any of us? And that's exactly what, dehumanizing. The vast majority of prisoners in solitary confinement in the U.S. will end up back in the streets. So they'll end up your neighbor. They'll end up probably going back to crime. And so to imagine that we can separate our fellow citizens and that their lives will never affect our lives is, of course, an illusion.
I want to open this up to question, but before, let's ask the question. Then I want to ask her about her podcast. I think this is the mic.
Hi. First of all, you are an amazing person. I cannot imagine that the way you have put all your experiences in a play sounds like an amazing thing to do. Then my question is that if a choice is given between capital punishment and solitary confinement, what would you, as a let's say a policy maker, what would you want to prefer?
To choose between capital punishment and solitary confinement?
Solitary confinement.
Ooh, I don't think I could make that. I don't believe in either. I don't believe that either benefits society in any way.
I agree with you, but given the choice between those two.
You can refuse to choose too, I guess. I guess that's a choice too.
So give me, flesh it out a little bit more.
Sure. For example, the same Nirbhaya case that Sandip was referring to, there's this person who has brutally raped a woman. Now he has to be given a punishment. Now he has done a terrible crime that I'm not sure if you've read about it.
I think I remember it.
You did.
Yeah. We were talking about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So in that case, the punishment that was given to a couple of, not all of them, some of them, was the capital punishment itself. Is it still fine to not give them capital punishment and let them be in solitary confinement so as to...
Oh, I understand the question, yeah. Well, I will say that some of the people that I interviewed in solitary confinement, one man in particular, he wrote this essay that went viral called A Sentence Worse Than Death. And he said that his 22 years in solitary confinement was like 1,000 deaths, that he would choose death any day. Now, I don't think that he can speak for everyone. I think a lot of people would choose any life over death. I don't think that we have the right to make this decision. If anything, why not give the prisoner this choice? That's the farthest I can go with that, because I don't think any human should have, that power over another.
Question here.
I'm interested in the nature, the form your work took. Was it purely, did you write a play? Are you the author of the play?
Yes.
And did you direct it as well?
No.
Did you create it? No. And the piece you wrote was it was obviously based on real interviews, real research, but it was a fictional narrative that wove in all of that together?
Exactly, yeah. It was based on over 75 interviews that I did with people in solitary confinement, and every detail, every single detail was real, but I took liberties in creating characters that were sort of, elevated to encompass many, many people, I guess, sort of hybrid characters.
And did you think about experimenting or considering other forms of, even within theater, something, verbatim and just other forms that move away from this? My question is really, I guess, doesn't this, at the end of the day, people coming in to watch what is a film which says based on real facts, and at the end says 7 years later this person is still in, but there is this suspension of disbelief that allows you into that world of the play, of course, and as you said, that accesses this part of your brain that feels like a lived experience. But doesn't that, and I guess this is where your study of cognitive science will answer this, but doesn't that also equally dissipate when I leave that world of the play? And then I'm thinking of it as a film and as in the fiction of that film, as opposed to there's nothing to deny at the end of the day about, a documentary that has given me facts, or, even a narrative documentary about, doesn't that allow me to just distance this, that, oh my God, I'm so emotionally moved, of course, but...
And you sort of check off the box,
story, but it's a story.
But it's a story,
oh,
yes.
Oh, you're
sure,
saying because it was fictionalized?
Because it took the form of kind of a play in the traditional sense of the word.
I mean, I still think that, okay, I mean, I tried to actually do both, and maybe it's sort of impossible to do both, but I think because people know me as a journalist, and they also know that I'm a survivor, I think that that gave me credibility as far as people suspending their disbelief and actually, fully accepting the reality that we created for them. I don't think that lives in the same form forever, but I think that there's a way that the stories that we carry within us are always with us. I mean, many people have read novels or poems or, met a person and heard something about their lives that 10 years later, you remember this anecdote, it comes up. I believe that, there's a lived memory. Is that what? I mean, I'm not saying.
A lot of parallel work around the play, apart from just writing about it as a journalist in the traditional sense again.
Maybe you should, we didn't get to it, but maybe you should also talk a little bit about the podcast you're doing right now.
Oh, okay, sure. So this is kind of separate, but I mean, I can't.
But it is parallel in a certain sense.
I mean, I think that the thread of my work has always been, trying to humanize and get past this, othering. So prisoners, before you know their stories, they're just numbers, right? And even if you care a great deal about how many people are in solitary confinement, how much can you really care when it's just a number, 100,000 people, and you have no idea, what they look like or what, how they grew up or what they did to get there, exactly. So my podcast is called Of Two Minds, and it's about getting past this tribalism, this us and them mentality, and creating conversations across great divides, where people are deeply invested but also deeply divided. So a conversation between a warden and a prisoner, or a police person and someone whose son was killed by gang violence. or someone who thinks that robots are going to take over humanity and annihilate us, or someone that thinks they're going to save us and create some kind of utopia. So I think that these conversations across difference really need to happen.
Do you moderate the conversation, or do you just let them go at it, as it were?
I try to moderate. Whether they let me.
Do you wear like a shield or some kind of armor protection for this?
I mean, it does get pretty intense. The last one I yelled a little bit because they were ignoring me. You know, I start out by interviewing them separately on their backstories, so the sort of building blocks of their lives, their childhood, whatever joyful or most traumatic events shaped them, and they listen to each other's story. So I think that
they have a sense of the other before.
They have the sense of the other, and they already, you know, humanized. And that, I think, actually starts the conversation off with a very different tone.
So I wanted to ask that in traditional media forms, like you have amalgamated fact and fiction for a stage play, is it possible to create such story in traditional media, maybe on television or news or in print, to bring the facts and the fiction together to create a story which will have larger impact on the audience rather than just presenting plain facts, as the media majorly does?
Well, I would say, of course it's possible, and I think the best journalism does that. I think it's easier to do if it's more long form or, you know, deeper work. I think it's hard to do that when you have to, you know, churn out a story a day for a website. But I think you can always make an effort to do both, and I think that good journalists do.
I mean, it is. I mean, and I think that is the way you can, the only way really to get over this other divide. I mean, when I started, I used to work for First Post, and one of the first assignments I had was to come to Delhi because Baba Ramdev was having this rally in Ram Leela Maidan. You know, and I am very sort of anglicized, you know, upper middle class Bengali guy. I go to the Ram, and my editor, who was here at the Jagannathan, told me, you know, like, you have to set something of yourself aside and just listen to these people who come from much more lower middle class families. And they're, you know, and Baba Ramdev is sort of a God man, yoga guru figure. So instead of being, you know, you could sort of sneer at sort of his antics or be suspicious of his media empire or whatever, all of that. But the people who come to listen to him, he obviously means something enormous to them. And so you have to kind of give them, listen to their stories and sort of put your own prejudice about the God-man aside, because they're getting something from, you know, why have they come from across the country to watch him fast? And so that is, and that the only way to do that is to tell their stories. You know, you interview them, you ask them, why did you come here? What do you do at home? Which is including your own.
And that's why it's a very political choice, you know, what stories and what topics we cover, right? Because a lot of the stories that are not interesting to people, how do we get them to care if we have to do it in a very compelling way?
And in fact, what happened as a result of that, if you remember, the government broke in the middle of the night and raided it, arrested him. And one of these women that I had talked to, who was there, and so the next day she's on a train going back, and she actually calls me to tell me that story of what happened that night. And it would have never happened if I had not been sitting down. And it was really humbling because at that time it also felt like, my God, she's entrusting me. She was really traumatized by what happened, but that she's entrusting me with the story, you know, that I...
How much empathy do you find people have after the story you write, right? Because you're finally talking about a prison system where people are sent to prison presumably for a crime that has been committed. I mean, like she asked, like, you know, capital punishment or solitary. There is a sort of need to punish. So what is the solution then do people really empathize with somebody who's in solitary? Do they say, okay, that's fine, let's put them all together? Or this guy deserves more because, well, his crime was, well, worse.
I mean, I think that solitary confinement is a good example because if you accept that the function of it, the pretense that they use justify it is a lie. Then it takes apart the entire system, and you can't justify mass incarceration anymore. They say that the people in solitary confinement are the most dangerous, the most violent, and that's completely untrue. They're usually the most vulnerable populations, the people with mental illness that our prisons don't want to deal with. They don't have the resources, partially because we won't, pay as taxpayers for them to actually rehabilitate people. So I think that in the case of solitary confinement, it definitely makes a political argument. But I'm sorry, I forgot your question. Sorry. Oh, does it shift? I've seen a real change in the U.S. context since the issue of solitary confinement has been on the map and on people's radar. Before that, people just said, oh, they're animals, they're beyond help. And now I really believe that story has changed because of the journalism that's been done, because of the stories that have been told, and because of the actions of prisoners themselves organizing on such large scale. There was a hunger strike, which my play is roughly based on, in California, and it started by 4 people of 4 different races, which were supposed to be sworn enemies in solitary confinement, and it spread, and over 20,000 prisoners across the state went on hunger strike to end solitary confinement. And I think that that really brought it to sort of international attention for the first time.
I'll ask one last one, just briefly. In light of everything you've shared today, and when you go to these panels and talk about it, do you sometimes feel, let me phrase this correctly, that there's something really terrible happened to you? Do you feel there's also this kind of also weird pressure for you to then to turn it into something inspiring? The Reader's Digest story of how I went to prison and now I have emerged better person or something from it.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that question. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that there's a tremendous amount of that because people especially want to see it as a sort of hopeful story. People need hopeful stories, right? There are things that have opened up for me, a way that my humanity has expanded because of the way that I suffered, that I will readily say that I'm happy about. Those of us that have suffered, we all suffer, right, at one point or another in our lives. And it gives you an opportunity for greater understanding because we live in a world full of suffering. So if you're sort of sheltered from that suffering, how can you really truly understand the world? So I see that as being a gift, and I also see it as being a curse because the pain of that situation, I still see it, I still feel it with my mother. The way that it's changed our relationship, the way that it's changed her fundamentally. I would do anything. I would take it all away just to take that away. That her suffering away. If that makes sense. Suffering is never justified. You could only move forward in the best way possible, but. I would never wish it on anyone else. So, of course, I don't know how to say it. Did I answer your question?
You did. You totally answered my question. Suki has it. I was I'm trying not to end on a really heavy note here.
I was also struggling not to.
One of the things that I'm curious is because in almost every element of the story, the ones who are making rules, the ones you have to rely on, or, even having gone through this much pain and for that to have any meaning, all of that is kind of opposite what we expect, right? When you said governments basically told you not to criticize what happened in the prison, actually it was when you didn't do that, when you didn't follow that advice, things started moving, or where you were even captured to begin with, it seemed a meaningless thing, really, because there wasn't actually anything achieved by that. Or, so basically what I question, and also you just said solitary confinement actually does not work, although that's the reason they give, right? So every single step of the way, the official rule or the system doesn't seem to work.
Or the story that we accept, the story we've been told, right?
Yeah, and I think my question is then how does that affect you as a writer and a thinker? You know, because it can only be incredibly cynical, the response, when nothing is, no system is working in this case. So how does that affect you in every way, I think, is my question.
Maybe in a way I was a little bit lucky that I didn't go into it having those beliefs. I mean, maybe I went in, I mean, I never had faith in any government, you know, especially not my own. My mother raised me to be very skeptical and of power and authority. So I don't think that my orientation towards government fundamentally changed. I just think that my beliefs were strengthened and tested, if that makes sense. But I do think that I tend to be I think I have to work hard and a part of my challenge is to constantly restore my faith in humanity, because I do think that as humans we can be quite weak. We sort of too easily give in to these powers that we know are unjustified and illegitimate. And I think that if anything, what gives me hope and strength in humanity is when I see people not, you know, cowering or accepting the line that they've been told, you know, people challenging. And there are plenty of people like that. I just have to seek it out so that I don't succumb to that cynicism that you're talking about, which is also very real.
I think we have to end right now. Is that?
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you. What a wonderful
Sandip.
dialogue. Thank you.
Yeah, it was really an interesting and intimate session, and we all really appreciate it. Thank you.